What if Boise State and San Diego State joined the Big East Football Conference? That in itself sounds like a preposterous statement that doesn't even make any sense. But if you're a little older or if you're well versed in your college football history, you'll know that this was a move that was announced. It was going to happen. Boise State and San Diego State were set to become football-only members of the Big East. And then the move fell through. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about how this move would have had a significant impact on the future of college football and talk about what the future might have looked like if that move had actually happened. Before we can talk about the Boise State and San Diego State situation, we first need to familiarize you with the history of the Big East Football Conference. It's one that hasn't existed in the college football lexicon since 2014 when they changed their branding to the American Conference. The Big East still lives on in basketball, but a lot of those teams, and most of them, UConn being the one exception, don't have football programs at the FBS level. So the Big East Football Conference at its peak was from 1991 to 2003, where its members were Virginia Tech, Rutgers, Temple, Boston College, Miami, West Virginia, Syracuse, and Pitt. A lot of teams that you know for being in the ACC these days, or the Big Ten in some cases, or the Big 12 in some cases. And this conference was at its peak. It had teams that were winning national titles. It had teams that were in the national title, like Virginia Tech and Miami, and it had some really prestigious programs. During this stretch from 1991 to 2003, they were finishing with 2, 3, and sometimes 4 or 5 teams in the top 25. It was a prestigious conference in college football, and it was considered a power conference during this time. Not one of the traditional powers like the ACC or the Big 12 or the Big 10 or the Pac-12 or the SEC, but no, the Big East was another power conference. For a number of reasons, the least of which being football success, teams started to slowly trickle away from the Big East. From 2004 to 2012, they lost Virginia Tech and Boston College and Miami to the ACC, which was a really tough blow to the conference. And so the conference during these pivotal years was struggling to find a way to stay afloat and stay relevant. Now, by 2012, West Virginia, Pitt, Syracuse, Louisville, and Rutgers had all also announced they were going to be departing, going to the Big 12, ACC, and then Rutgers going to the Big 10, respectively there. And so that really left them with Cincinnati, South Florida, and UConn as the only remaining members from the Big East Football Conference. They were stuck in a pretty pivotal time, but the Big East still had a fair amount of pull, so they made a big-time announcement in the 2013 season. They were going to be sending invites and having SMU, Temple, East Carolina, UCF, Tulsa, Tulane, Memphis, Houston, and then of course San Diego State and Boise State come join the conference. Now, it was at this same time that the conference underwent a rebrand. Instead of being called the Big East Conference, they decided to name themselves the American Athletic Conference, and everything was going smoothly. In fact, of these invites they sent out, 8 of them went through. These might be a lot of teams that you recognize as some of the current members of the American Athletic Conference in the modern age of college football. But San Diego State and Boise State ended up getting cold feet. So that's the subject of this video. So the big question you might have right off the bat is, why did San Diego State and Boise State get cold feet? And the answer to that is they simply thought the Big East was going to be more stable when they agreed to do that. They didn't realize all of those teams that ended up leaving were going to leave. So all it took was just a few more teams stepping out the door for them to go back to the Mountain West, where it was considered one of the better Group of 5 conferences. In fact, it was considered the best if you can consider the Big East a power conference. At that point, Boise State and San Diego State were trying to accept an invite to a power conference, but then by the time they got there, they looked around at the teams there and realized, hey, wait a minute, the Mountain West is just as prestigious as this conference. We have some pretty great programs there, and if we're joining this new American Conference, Boise State and San Diego State will be 2 of the best programs there. So they're leaving where they're the flagship teams of one conference to just be the flagship teams of a different conference, where geographically it makes a lot less sense for them. So eventually they got cold feet, and it makes a lot of sense in hindsight, seeing why they made that decision at the time. But if the move had actually gone through and we had this conference, the conference would have been with 13 teams, Boise State and San Diego State being among them, I think this would have changed a lot, especially in the immediate aftermath. If you look at the immediate aftermath, the Mountain West would be stuck very unstable without its two flagship programs in Boise State and San Diego State. Now, they had a number of moves they could have made at this time. The Mountain West, if they acted quick enough, maybe they could have added a team like New Mexico State and UTEP, teams that make sense geographically, teams that have some rivalries built into that conference, but it could operate in a very similar manner to what we just witnessed in real life when Boise State and San Diego State were sapped from the Mountain West, which is teams like Colorado State and Fresno State and maybe Utah State and maybe UNLV, even though UNLV was much less of a built-up program back then, maybe lobbying for an American Conference invite. We could have ended up maybe with a 16-team American Conference that added Boise State and Fresno State and Utah State. It's a very interesting thought project to have about this move happening at this time. But truthfully, I really think that there's some other teams on the table here. Army and Navy were teams that eventually got extended invites by the American. Those teams would be on the table as well. BYU was an independent team. Maybe if they saw Boise State and San Diego State joining, they would think that's attractive enough to actually pull off the move. Air Force is another team from the Mountain West that might be considered. And then there's maybe a program like Rice in the group of five. If the American got ultra aggressive, they could have just put a full monopoly on the top group of five conference and asserted themselves as the number one group of five conference, no doubt. But the part that I think would be even more interesting is if the American Conference settled with the moves they had made. They added Boise State and San Diego State successfully, and then they waited and waited and waited. And if the American Conference could have held itself together until this recent round of realignment, I think the death of the Pac-12 could have been something they benefited off of a lot. You're looking at some of the teams that were left over after other teams went to the Big 12 and the ACC and the Big 10, although in this case, not the ACC. You're left with Washington State, Oregon State, Stanford, and Cal sitting over as the leftovers. And they can't really do what they did in real life, which is add Boise State and San Diego State and some other flagship Mountain West schools to try and recreate the Pac-12. Instead, those teams would already be in the American Conference. And so all of a sudden, Oregon State and Washington State would have a difficult decision to make. Yeah, they could try and poach those teams, but they'd probably have a lot less pull. Instead, we could be living in a world where Oregon State and Washington State and maybe even Stanford and Cal end up joining the American Conference. For Stanford and Cal, I know that's a little bit of a leap because they consider themselves to be prestigious institutions. They might not want to share a conference with Temple and Tulsa and even a program like Boise State. Academically, all that stuff. There's a lot of other things that, like I said, aren't football related that factor in here. But in a best case scenario, the American Conference could have been looking pretty dang strong if they were able to hold on to Cincinnati, Houston, and SMU, add Oregon State and Washington State, Cal and Stanford, and BYU. It'd be a little bit of a mess, but they'd very clearly have a Western League that's made up of some of those former Mountain West and Pac-12 schools, maybe be an attractive spot for BYU, and who knows, maybe this could have even served as a basis to luring some of the other Pac-12 schools like Arizona and Arizona State. Maybe they could have built another conference regarded to be a power conference. I still think a more realistic outcome would be one where things play out similarly to how they did in real life. You lose Cincinnati and Houston and SMU and UCF to power conferences. BYU probably doesn't end up joining this conference either. And then you just end up with a spot where you add Oregon State and Washington State, a couple other Mountain West schools like Fresno State and Colorado State, as well with Army and Navy. But this is an interesting conference, and it's a different conference. Based on the recent realignment rumors, it sounds like Memphis, Tulane, and South Florida, the Pac-12, is just not going to happen. The Pac-12 is going to end up basically being a glorified Mountain West where they chop off the bottom four teams and then they add Oregon State and Washington State. That's what it looks like right now. But in this outcome, you're ending up with a clear number one group of five conference. That's basically a group of five super conference, taking those teams like Memphis and Tulane, Boise State, and Oregon State that are the top in terms of facilities, in terms of recruiting, in terms of relative football success of the group of five right now, and just putting them in all one conference. I think it would be a very interesting thing to see. But that was just a thought exercise I had. I was reminded of this move or move that didn't happen a while ago, and I thought it might be fun to take a look at what college football's future would have been if the move actually went through. That does it for this video, though. Let me know down in the comments, what are your biggest realignment what-ifs? Things that you think about. Maybe if the Big 12 hadn't added BYU and Houston and UCF and Cincinnati, would those teams even be in a power conference right now? It's those types of things that are very interesting to think about. And there's been a lot of realignment what-ifs that have happened over the last even 5 years or so. But let me know down in the comments, what are the realignment things you think about? And that's all I got for you guys in this video. I will see you guys later this week.